The file begins. Year 2026. The name Allison Mack is now a ghost, an artifact buried beneath a heavier, more grounded name, Meeink. It is her voluntary exile, a quiet life in a quiet town, studying social work as if searching for an academic formula capable of reconstructing a soul. Her world, once illuminated by studio spotlights and camera flashes, now gleams with the sterile light of a laptop screen and the muted sun from a suburban window. The fame she craved has become a prison. The anonymity she gained, her parole. She moves through the world like a phantom, her face familiar enough to elicit a flicker of recognition, followed by the cold shadow of memory. The girl next door from Smallville. The monster from the headlines. Both images are true, both false. Her past is not a story she tells. It is a brand she wears. Not only what is seared into her flesh by her master, but what is imprinted on the public consciousness. An indelible stain on a once shining legacy. The anatomy of her fall is dissected on podcasts, but the anatomy of her penance is lived in silence. A silence that smells of cheap coffee and expensive regret. But before the silence, there was noise, a deafening roar of condemnation. The verdict was no mere legal document. It was a public execution of a person. In the sterile chill of the courtroom, the actress ceased to exist. In her place stood the accused, Mack. Every tear shed was analyzed for sincerity. Every apology weighed on the scales of the hurt she'd caused. The public wanted a simple monster, but the court records painted a more chilling picture. A willing accomplice. The fall wasn't a singular event, but a series of fateful missteps, each a rung down a spiral staircase into darkness. The first lie, the first recruitment, the first time she chose power over empathy. It was these moments that sealed her fate, long before the judge spoke his word. Her 3-year sentence, to some, felt like a betrayal of the victims. To others, it was the final, inevitable scene in a tragedy she co-authored. She traded her fame for a role in a real-life horror film. And the price was pause everything. Her name, her freedom, her future. All reduced to rubble, an empire built on lies. But before the rubble, there was a blueprint, a meticulous design for a life destined for the cover of a magazine. Born not in Hollywood, but in the disciplined quiet of Preetz, Germany, her childhood was a masterclass in preparation. Every smile was rehearsed, every line delivered with a precision that belied her age. This wasn't a child, it was an asset in development. Her early career was a series of calculated steps up a ladder that seemed to have no top. Then came Smallville, a decade-long residency in the global consciousness. She wasn't the superhero. She was the friend, the confidant, the moral compass. A bitter irony, in retrospect. The world saw Chloe Sullivan, the relentless seeker of truth. They did not see Allison Mack, who was beginning a desperate search for her own. The applause was deafening. The silence that followed, pause, was heavier. A void was forming, a vacuum that fame and a steady paycheck could not fill. It was in that silence that a new voice began to whisper. The whisper had a name. It was called Executive Success Programs, NXIVM. It didn't arrive with horns and a pitchfork. It arrived in a business suit, carrying a binder, and promising a breakthrough. For an actress feeling pigeonholed by her own success, this was not a cult, it was a curriculum. A postgraduate course in human potential, taught by a man they called Vanguard. Keith Raniere was not sold as a messiah. He was presented as a polymath, a recluse of formidable intellect. The organization's language was a carefully crafted sedative. All talk of ethics, humanity, and potential. It was a perfect lure for the lost and the ambitious. Mack attended a session initially with a fellow actress. She wasn't looking for a god. She was looking for a tool to fix a career she felt was stalling, to fix herself. They diagnosed her problem with unnerving accuracy. Then, they offered her the cure, a fatal prescription. The first lesson in her anatomy of a fall was simple. To rebuild herself, she first had to be completely broken down. The cure was not a single dose. It was a regimen. A slow, intravenous drip of validation mixed with a subtle, corrosive poison. Mack was no longer just a student. She was becoming part of the curriculum. Her proximity to Keith Raniere became the new currency of her life, a replacement for the fading glow of television fame. He saw her utility, a familiar, trustworthy face to front an insidious enterprise. She was not just selling a program, she was selling the very salvation she craved, using her own story as the primary exhibit. The Smallville fame that once felt like a cage was repurposed. It became a gilded net. Her ascent within the hierarchy wasn't a climb. It was a surrender. Each new level of access, each new title, was another lock clicking shut. She was promoted from patient to practitioner, granted the authority to diagnose the same sickness in others that NXIVM had found in her. Pause. She became a first-line master, a gatekeeper to the man they called Vanguard. This was her bitter legacy in the making. Recruitment was not an art. It was a science, a cold, repeatable process of identifying a vulnerability and applying precise, escalating pressure. Mack mastered this brutal calculus. The methodology was simple. Find a woman at a crossroads, professionally or personally. Isolate her. Love bomb her. Make her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. Then slowly, introduce the language of the program. The logic was a trap disguised as a ladder. Each rung of self-improvement was also a step deeper into the cage. The masterstroke of this psychological architecture was something they called collateral, a term sanitized of its true meaning. It was an insurance policy, a confession to a fabricated crime, a compromising photograph, a secret that could shatter a life. Pause. It was blackmail, delivered with a smile and the promise of personal growth. The grooming was a masterpiece of patient evil. It began with a compliment. It ended with a brand. This was the true anatomy of their power, not persuasion, but the systematic dismantling of a person's will to say no. But not every will could be broken. Fissures began to appear in the monolithic facade. The first cries for help were not screams. They were whispers. A concerned father, a journalist from a local Albany paper, a former high-ranking member who saw the rot from the inside and tried to walk away. Their warnings were treated as heresy. They were painted as bitter, as failures, as enemies of progress. Keith Mack, now a trusted lieutenant, was instrumental in this campaign. She wielded her television wholesomeness as a weapon, dismissing accusations with a placid smile that made the accusers seem hysterical. The evidence was there. A 2003 Forbes cover story had already branded Keith Raniere's organization a cult. But the truth was buried under an avalanche of litigation and the star power of its newest recruits. The sound of dissent was drowned out by the roar of success. A single alarm bell is meaningless in a room full of applause. The applause was a shield. Behind it, The architecture of control was entering its final, most depraved stage. A secret society was formed, known only to the chosen few. They called it DOS, an acronym for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, a Latin phrase that translates quite literally to master over the slave women. It was a pyramid scheme of pain, with Raniere at the apex and Mack as one of his first-line masters. Her task, to recruit her own circle of slaves, who would in turn be pressured to find their own. The price of entry was absolute obedience. The ultimate proof of loyalty was the brand. In clandestine ceremonies, women were held down, naked, while a doctor used a cauterizing pen to burn a symbol into their skin. Pause. No anesthetic. The mark seared into their flesh near the hip was a 2-inch square design. It was presented as a mystical symbol. Only later did some realize it incorporated the initials of Keith Raniere. This was the final invoice for their self-improvement. A lifetime of servitude paid for in flesh. But flesh keeps records and whispers. Once they escape the soundproofed rooms of the faithful, travel far. They travel all the way to the Eastern District of New York. The federal government was not interested in self-improvement seminars. It was interested in a criminal enterprise. Investigators began their own inventory, not of sins, but of evidence. They collected the digital ghosts left behind in encrypted apps. They followed the money, a river of cash flowing into Raniere's accounts, laundered through a dozen shell corporations. Pause. Allison Mack's name was not just a footnote. It was a chapter heading in the indictment taking shape. They saw her emails, coercive, demanding, the anatomy of manipulation laid bare in cold digital type. They saw the bank transfers, the chain of command. This was not a sisterhood. It was a racketeering conspiracy. Pause. The feds were building a case, brick by painstaking brick, that would entomb them all. The bill for this empire of pain arrived on a quiet morning in April 2018. There were no cameras for this performance, just federal agents at the door of her Brooklyn apartment. Allison Mack, the master, the recruiter, was placed under arrest. Her name, once synonymous with a girl-next-door television hero, was now welded to phrases like sex trafficking and forced labor conspiracy. The shock was not the crime. The shock was the perpetrator. The cognitive dissonance was a national event. Chloe Sullivan from Smallville, the loyal sidekick, was now the villain in a story far darker than any comic book plot. Her first court appearance was a public vivisection. The power she wielded in DOS evaporated under the fluorescent lights of the judiciary. She was no longer a master. She was Defendant Mack. Pause. The ankle monitor they fitted her with was a different kind of brand. A digital leash. A constant humming reminder that the audit of her life had officially begun, and there would be no redemption. Pause. Only a reckoning. The reckoning arrived not as a single clap of thunder, but as a death by 1,000 cuts. Each cut was a voice, a testimony. The women Mack had groomed, the slaves she had commanded, began to speak. And the courtroom became an archive of pain. Their stories were not just about the searing brand on their skin. That was crude, almost primitive. The true anatomy of the abuse was in the psychological architecture Mack helped build. The collateral, naked photographs, family secrets, confessions of imagined crimes. Pause. All cataloged and stored, ready to be deployed to ensure compliance. Witnesses spoke of starvation diets disguised as discipline, sleep deprivation presented as a tool for enlightenment. Their identities were systematically dismantled, piece by piece, and replaced with devotion to Raniere, policed by Mack. They weren't just victims. They were assets. And Allison Mack was a meticulous asset manager in this portfolio of broken souls. Each tearful account on the stand was another line item in the final, posthumous audit of her public life. Faced with this inventory of sins, Mack's first move was predictable: denial. Her initial plea was not guilty, a final, defiant salute to a fallen king. For a time, she inhabited the role of the loyal soldier, standing guard at the gates of a phantom empire. But empires of lies have foundations of sand, and the prosecution's evidence was a tidal wave: recordings, emails, the damning testimony of the very women she had broken. The cold calculus of the law began to replace the twisted logic of the cult. Her lawyers laid out the math. It was brutal, unsentimental. A lifetime behind federal walls. The shadow of the bunker was long and cold, so she made a choice. Not of conscience, but of survival. The plea was changed. The master became the state's primary exhibit. She turned on Keith Raniere, the man she called Vanguard. This wasn't a sudden awakening. It was a calculated transaction. She traded loyalty for a chance at daylight. Remorse is a powerful currency in the halls of justice. And Allison Mack, facing the abyss, discovered she had a story to sell. The price of her own abbreviated sentence was the definitive conviction of her mentor. The trial of Keith Raniere was not her trial, but it was her sentence being written in real time. Every piece of testimony, every tearful witness, every damning exhibit was another stone laid on the pyramid of his guilt, and her freedom was mortgaged against its peak. She was a ghost in that courtroom, a name on a list of co-conspirators who had seen the light. Or at least, the fluorescent glare of a federal holding cell. The proceedings became the posthumous audit of a bankrupt philosophy. The self-proclaimed genius, the man who held seminars on ethics, was now the subject of a very simple, brutal lesson in cause and effect. His own voice, captured on tape, became the prosecution's star witness, confident, arrogant, condemning himself with every syllable. The master manipulator was now just another man in a bad suit, watching his legacy be dismantled by the very system he thought he was above. The verdict came: guilty on all counts. The Vanguard's reign ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical reading of a jury foreman. The empire was officially rubble. And Allison Mack, the loyal soldier, had successfully traded the architect of her ruin for a few more years of daylight. Anatomy of a scar. It was the cult's most sacred and most profane sacrament. The branding, a ritual sold as an act of empowerment, a permanent commitment to a noble cause. The truth was colder, more primitive. It was an act of ownership. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. A cold room, a naked woman on a table, other women, her sisters in the sorority, holding her down. Not with malice, but with the dead-eyed conviction of the truly brainwashed. The instrument was not a needle. It was a cauterizing pen. The smell was of burning flesh. The mark itself was a piece of staggering hubris, a cryptic symbol that, when analyzed, revealed the initials of the master himself. Keith Raniere. He was signing his property. This was not a sisterhood, it was a herd. And Mack was no mere participant. She was a high priestess of this degradation, a gatekeeper to the pain. This secret, this indelible proof of subjugation, was meant to bind them all together in silence. It was their fatal mistake. The brand became a beacon, a physical piece of evidence that juries could understand. It turned abstract concepts like coercion and manipulation into something visceral. Pause. A permanent invoice for a debt of pain, seared into the skin. The brand was a physical invoice, but the emotional debts were cataloged elsewhere, in the wreckage of her personal life. Her first marriage to actress Nicki Clyne was not a union of hearts. It was a strategic maneuver, a cold transaction executed on behalf of the cult to circumvent immigration laws. The wedding photos, if they exist, are evidence not of love, but of conspiracy. A marriage certificate as a weapon. Pause. Then there were her parents, the original sin. They were the ones who led their daughter to the gates of NXIVM, hoping to polish a star, but instead delivering her to the abattoir. Their public silence after her arrest was a deafening roar of shame, or perhaps complicity. The family unit fractured, an empire of affection reduced to rubble. Her redemption, or the performance of it, began with another union, forged in ruin. She married Frank Meeink, a man with his own history of branding and belief, a former neo-Nazi skinhead. Their marriage is a strange and desperate piece of theater, a pact between two former monsters, each hoping the other's reformed reflection will make their own seem more believable. It is an attempt to build a new life on a foundation of ash, a fragile hope that two broken histories can somehow make a whole future. Before the law delivered its verdict, the media had already passed its sentence. The story first festered on the internet's fringes, on blogs written by apostates. They were dismissed, ignored, the ravings of the disgruntled. But then the story broke through the membrane of respectable journalism. Pause. The New York Times. That's when the feeding frenzy began. The media machine required a simple narrative, and Allison Mack was the perfect villain. Keith Raniere was a reclusive, uncharismatic phantom. But Mack, she was the girl next door, the trusted friend from a decade of television. The betrayal felt personal to millions who had never met her. Her fall was more spectacular, more cinematic. She was cast as the siren, the pretty blonde face of evil. It was a simple, brutal, and highly profitable story. The nuance of her own indoctrination, the slow creeping fog of coercion that had enveloped her, was an inconvenient detail. It was trimmed from the final cut. Pause. In the courtroom of public opinion, she was not a complex figure, a victim who became a perpetrator. She was just the monster. The headlines were the hammer, the nightly news, the nails. They built her digital coffin long before she ever saw the inside of a prison cell. The verdict when it came was not a thunderclap. It was the quiet, administrative click of a file drawer closing. The public wanted fire and brimstone. They had been promised a monster, and monsters require epic punishments. But Judge Nicholas Garofis was not in the business of public spectacle. He was conducting an inventory of sins, and one asset offset the liabilities. Pause. Cooperation. Mack had handed the prosecution the keys to Keith Raniere's kingdom. She drew them a map of the inner sanctum. This was not redemption. It was a transaction. Her secrets were traded for years of her life. The prosecution recommended 14 years. The judge delivered 3. A calculated discount for services rendered. For the victims, it was a betrayal, a slap on the wrist for a lifetime of trauma. For the media, a disappointing final act. But for Mack, it was the cold hard logic of the system. She was no longer the siren. She was state's Exhibit A. A broken tool, yes, but a tool that had done its job. The gavel fell, but the sound was absorbed by the thick carpet of the courtroom. Her sentence was not a punishment. It was a price. Her release from the federal prison in Dublin, California, was an exercise in silence. No cameras, no grand exit. She walked out of one prison and into another, larger one, a digital panopticon where every move would be monitored not just by a parole officer, but by the entire world. This was the anatomy of her new existence, an exile in plain sight. Her freedom came with conditions etched in stone, who she could talk to, where she could go. Her life was now a curated, approved script. The first act of this new life was not a return to the stage, but a retreat into academia, social work, an attempt to anatomize the very poison she once administered. A penance, perhaps, or simply a search for a language to understand her own mutilated fate. Then came the marriage. A union with another reform pariah, a former neo-Nazi. It was not a romance novel. It was a pact of survivors. Two people with indelible pasts trying to build a future on the rubble of their former selves. A shared understanding of an unforgivable brand. She took his name, a flimsy shield against a hailstorm of public memory. But a name is just a label on a box. The contents remain the same. The contents remain the same. The public confession arrived on schedule, delivered via podcast. A calculated autopsy of a rotted soul, performed for an audience hungry for the scent of decay. Her voice, a carefully calibrated instrument of regret, spoke of taking responsibility, of the trauma she caused. But atonement in the digital age is just another form of content. A performance. Each episode was a meticulously curated artifact for her own postmortem audit, an attempt to rebrand a legacy of ruin. The pursuit of a degree in social work was another exhibit, the master manipulator learning the clinical language for her own pathology. It wasn't about healing others. It was about finding a new vocabulary to explain herself to herself. The marriage was the final piece of this reconstructed identity. A pact, a treaty between two figures exiled from polite society, their shared history of destruction, a strange and bitter foundation. But the public is not a priest. It does not grant absolution. Every word of remorse was scrutinized. Every tear weighed for its sincerity. And the verdict from the digital Colosseum was nearly unanimous. Pause forgery. So ends the inventory of sins. The anatomy of a fall that began not in a secret sorority, but in the blinding glare of a spotlight. Allison Mack was a case study, a specimen of a particular Hollywood hunger, the desperate need for meaning in a world of scripts and fake smiles. Keith Raniere did not create the void inside her. He simply filled it. He gave her purpose, a dark and twisted one, and she, in turn, became his most effective instrument. A smiling, familiar face that made the unthinkable seem reasonable. The story is not about a monster. It is about the terrifying ease with which one can be made. The legacy she leaves is not a filmography. It is a brand. Not the one seared into flesh, but the one burned into public memory. A permanent sigil of betrayal. Her fate is a quiet, ongoing sentence, served not in a cell but in a life stripped of its former gloss. The money is gone. The fame is an infection. The future is a long, flat road of monitored conversations and public suspicion. There is no redemption arc here. There is only the long, cold epilogue, the chilling silence after the verdict has been read. Pause. The name on the digital tombstone is irrelevant.